Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment of Microsoft Reactor. Today, we're going to be going through end-to-end app development with Visual Studio Code. So we're going to learn about specifically about how to work with Git a little bit, and then a little bit of how to work with Node and Express to deploy an app using Azure App Service. Wanted to give a quick shout out to all of the people around the world who may be joining us for this event. I personally am hailing from Seattle, Washington, so I'm over on this side of the world, which is why you may notice that my time zone is dramatically different from yours. And I just, it's really quite wonderful and impressive how we can, all be part of a global community of learners. It's really wonderful. So a quick little tidbit about myself. I'm the engineering lead for Transparent Classroom, which builds software for Montessori schools. I'm also an active maintainer of an open source repository called FlowTyped, which if any of you are JavaScripters, yes, I'm aware that TypeScript won that battle. I'm still helping them out. I'm a really big fan of test-driven development, functional programming, and clean code. I started teaching 14 years ago doing social dancing. And I've been teaching classes worldwide since then. Obviously, that is not such a thing, not really a thing right now, but and then at some point I picked up teaching software as well because I just really love to get to share new insights and learning with people. If you ever want to learn more about me, you can check out my website, andrewsouthpaw.com. I've got a collection of articles and musings. So I apologize, this agenda is slightly off. I meant to add one other piece before this, which is we will start by talking about what is Git and how to work with GitHub. Then we'll talk about what is Node and set up a basic full stack app. And then we will practice deploying that app to Azure App Service. Any questions before we get started? And I think it's worth noting that as we go along, questions are always strongly encouraged. There tends to be a bit of a lag. So by the time that I've spoken the words out of my mouth and the point at which it reaches you, there may be about a 30-second to a minute-long delay. So what I've found is that the best way to do it is just as soon as you have a question, just feel free to ask it in the Q&A. And when there are natural pauses in what I'm talking about, I will go through those Q&A questions. So please don't be shy. These classes are always so much more fun when people are asking questions along the way. Great, well, let's get started. So a lot of what this course is going to be about is really just highlighting the extensible architecture and features of Visual Studio Code, which makes it, frankly, the preferred code editor for so many software developers around the world. We'll start by learning about how it integrates with Git, which is the preferred source code management tool for most open source projects. And the really wonderful thing is that Visual Studio Code integrates really tightly with Git so that it makes the whole workflow feel really natural. I would say that one of the great things is like once you learn if you learned Git and all of the crazy arcane commands that go along with it, then having a UI to abstract a lot of that work for you can be really, really handy. So we're going to start by establishing a repository on GitHub, which is a public platform for hosting Git projects. And that's kind of an oversimplification of what GitHub is, but that is at least close to an approximation. Oops, I meant to give you a clean window. I'm sorry for that. There we go. You don't need to see my calendar. All right, so if we go to GitHub, it does a whole lot of things. It has become the sort of the hub for what we call DevOps and GitOps. It is a platform for sharing ideas, and it's like the lifeblood of the open source community. But at its core, it just is a place where you can host a Git project. So what we're going to do today is set up a project where we are working for a gaming company, and we need to establish a website to count down the days until the big release of the game. And this will be a very, very simple website. We're not going to do a whole lot with it. But we'll at least go through the process of learning how to work with Git and how to set up a full stack app. As far as Git goes, what we will be doing is creating a new repository, cloning it down, creating a branch, making some changes, going through the workflow of creating commits, and then pushing them to our repository. So for starters, let's go ahead and set up a new project. I'm going to call this repository game countdown. The countdown, and I'm going to add a description saying that this is the countdown to the really cool game that will be released. And I'm not going to worry about any of the other initializations, like adding a git ignore so that certain sort of stock files get not included. I'm just going to create the repository like so. And now I basically have a placeholder where I can store my code. So to begin with, we're going to now use this bucket and we're going to clone it down to our, oops, I meant to do one other thing. That's my bad. Website countdown. Let's try this one more time. And I do want to initialize it with a README, because otherwise I'm going to have to show you some extra steps that I don't want to have to explain. Great, here we go. So now I have this bucket where I can store all of my code. The first thing that I'm going to do is clone the repository. This means creating a copy from like on GitHub. I'm going to create a copy locally and basically hook it together so that I tell my local copy that it wants to communicate with this public copy. So I'm going to copy this URL. And then I'm going to clone it using Visual Studio Code. So for that, I'm going to open up my terminal. And I'm going to open up my browser in this sandbox folder where I can play around. So to clone with Visual Studio Code, all I need to do is open up the command palette, which I can do with Control-Shift-P for Windows or Command-Shift-P for Mac. And then that gives me a bunch of options here. And I'm actually going to increase the size a little bit just to make it easier to read for you all. And then I'll say clone, and that gives me this option. This then asks me to provide a URL, which is that URL I copied from the GitHub website. And then it asks me to provide a location. So I want to put this inside of my projects, into my sandbox. I have a lot of projects. And I'll choose this repository location. Great. And now we can see that I've copied down my repository there. So we now have all of the code copied down. Let's take a pause and go through any Q&A questions. Do I have a name for the Git repository? So Simeon, I'm hearing you ask if there's a name for the Git repo. We are following along on a couple of different exercises that I'll link to at the end of the course. But if you want to, I can also give those links to you now. Let's go ahead and open up the chat. So here is the first one. And then here is the second one. So these are the basic exercises, and I'm kind of pulling from both simultaneously in a way that makes sense. So those are posted in the chat. All right, there's another question. Are you going to deploy a web-based app? Yes, it'll be a web-based app, and we will not be covering any JavaScript libraries. We're going to keep it super simple. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is practice creating a branch to store some changes. So I'm going to click on my branch down here and say I'm going to create a new branch. And I'm going to say that this is the update readme branch. Then I can make some new changes. This stores, this is the project where we count down to the final game release date. And I'll save that. And so now we can see that I have some changes here that Git is keeping track of. If I want to, I can go over to the Git palette and see which changes have been made. So I can see that under these changes, if I click on this file, I can see the diff between the two. So this is sort of like running your Git status in the command line, if you ever wanted to do that. So once I'm satisfied with the changes that I've made, I can go ahead and click the plus icon, which says that I want to stage these changes for a commit. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Git, the basic way of thinking of it is that the staging is where you're saying, these are the changes that I want to put into a new commit. And that is how I think of staging. Quite often we want to include all of our changes, so we just stage all of the changes and then we make the commit. So first we have to stage them. And now we can see that they have been set to be staged. And then once we're done with that, I can click this check mark icon up here and commit it. And then I need to provide a commit message. Update the README to describe the project. And we now have a new commit created. So I'm pretty satisfied with my changes. Now I want to practice pushing my code up to my repository. So I'm going to click this little icon down here that says publish changes. And all that's doing is basically taking my branch and sending it up to the GitHub repository. So if I go back over to here and I refresh the page, I can choose which branch I'm looking at from GitHub over here, and I can select the update README branch. And I can see that it has the changes that I created. Now let's show doing it. So that was more like a Git push. Now let's talk about a Git pull. Let's say that somebody else, maybe somebody from the GitHub UI, made some changes here. And I'm going to add another note here saying everyone is so excited. And the commit message that I'm going to include is to explain how excited everyone is. And I'm going to make this commit on that branch. So now my origin has more recent changes than what I have locally. And I would imagine that if I close and reopen my VS Code just to make it check faster, usually it will tell me that there are some changes to be pulled down, but it looks like that's not happening right now. So, but if I go to my README, I can see that I do not have those changes yet. And so just to make sure that I have all of the latest changes, all I need to do is click that sync button again. And now it pulls down my new code. So this is your Git pull. So once I'm pretty satisfied with the code, I can go ahead and create a pull request. Where I'm going to summarize the changes. I can see the summary of changes over here under the File Changes tab. There's a whole bunch of functionality that GitHub offers here that is sort of beyond the scope of this course, but it's also worth definitely checking out. And once people are satisfied, then I can merge the pull request. I'll go ahead and delete the branch, and then I can go back to the repository, and we can see that on my main branch now, we have the latest code changes. So now all I need to do back in VS Code is to synchronize things again. I will go back to my main branch, click that sync button again, and now I have the latest changes. Any questions about the Git patterns that we've shown here today? So I see a question from Atina, or Atina perhaps, that about whether the Git code plugin is available immediately or does it need to be installed. Git comes bundled with VS Code, so you do not need to install any plugins for that. And David pointed out that if I do reload window, that is also a way to sort of just restart my code editor. So thanks, David, for that suggestion. There's also a question of how does the sync button know whether to do a push or pull? There's basically Git is able to know whether you have more recent changes or whether they have more recent changes, they being like, the origin. If you both have additional changes, then there needs to be some reconciling that needs to happen, and you can be guided through that process with VS Code. Unfortunately, we don't have time to show that particular process in this case, but you can just rest assured that for the most part, it does what you need, and then when it isn't a super simple case, then it handles that as well. There's also a question of where to push the code. And I would say that we are pushing to the repository that we created inside of GitHub here. So that is where you would be pushing your code. There's one other feature worth calling out with GitHub before we move on to the full stack app development, which is this concept of contributing to other repositories. So for example, with flow typed, which is the repository that I work with a fair bit, if you wanted to contribute to this repository, there isn't a way for you to have immediate access to it. Instead, what you do is you create what we call a fork, which is a sort of like a clone, except it's with a repository inside of GitHub, as opposed to cloning from GitHub down to your local machine. You're cloning a repository from one place in GitHub to another place in GitHub, so we call it forking. It's a concept that was sort of popularized by GitHub. So with forking, you get your own copy of the repository and you connect your copy of the repository to the original copy of the repository. And then you can make your changes in your own copy when you clone it down. So you fork and then you clone. And in so doing, you can make your edits and then propose changes from your fork back to the original, which we often call the upstream. So to be able to fork a repository, all you have to do is click this fork button up here. I've already forked the repository because I'm a contributor to the repo, but you would see the option to create a fork. Once you do so and you look at your fork version, you can see that it is saying that it is forked from the original. I'm seeing a question from Steve of, does the main branch replace the old school master branch that I've seen before? Looks like it is. I think that this may be a new feature that GitHub has released in an effort to be a little bit more, socially conscientious, which makes sense. There's a question from an anonymous person of, is there a list of pull and push in VS Code? I don't believe so. But fortunately, if you want to get a recap on how pull and push work, you can always check out the links that we shared both in the Q&A and in the chat on the use Git from VS Code. Any other questions so far? Cool. So we have covered some concepts of Git. Granted, we could spend multiple days learning about Git, so we are only covering a very cursory glance of how Git works and how it integrates with VS Code. But hopefully this has given you a quick snippet of some of the many cool integrations that VS Code offers. And it can do a whole lot more with Git. It's just that this is only a introductory course. The next part is to focus on creating a web application with VS Code, and then deploying that web application to the real world using what is called Azure App Service, which integrates really nicely with VS Code. So for this portion of the class, we're going to be using a JavaScript, Node.js, and Express.js framework to be able to set up a full stack web application. So to give you a quick recap on what Node.js is to explain what Node.js is, we need to explain one other thing first, which is that JavaScript is a language used in browsers to be able to add behavior to web pages and interactivity. So that was really great. But then people were saying, well, like, I would really like to be able to use JavaScript outside of the browser, but right now it's only available inside of the browser. Thus, Node.js was born. Node.js provides what we call a runtime environment so that you can run JavaScript outside of the browser and inside of your like a terminal, for instance. So this was a really, really, really big deal because suddenly you could use Node.js, you could use JavaScript code on the server. And then that just led to an explosion of creativity and innovation and iteration on creating a server-side framework, server-side frameworks that are written in JavaScript as opposed to one of the many other languages that are available. A lot of people like this because it allows you to use the same language in both places. So that sometimes even means that you can share code between both, although not always. But you know, a lot of people really do appreciate being able to just stay focused in one language and not having to keep context switch all of the time. It could make it easier for onboarding for sure. Node.js is open source, free, and it runs on most operating systems, including Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. One of the big features that Node.js brought was that it runs its code what we call asynchronously. So it does not, and this is just a feature of, this is basically a feature of JavaScript, which is that the language is set up so that it can keep checking in on a task. And if it's not ready yet, then we don't do anything with it. So this is a really big deal for the backend because quite often we're waiting on I/O tasks like reading from a database or opening a file or processing something that isn't synchronous in its nature. And Node.js would be able to say, hey, I want to go make a database request. While I'm waiting for that to come back, I'm going to keep serving other requests to my server. Contrast that with Rails, for instance. If you make a request to Rails and it talks to the database, it has to wait for the database to come back before it can continue processing the work. So a lot of people feel that Node.js, for that reason, scales better. It can respond to requests faster, or it can respond to more requests faster, rather. So now that we've covered a little bit about Node, let's talk about Express. So Node does provide a way to build an entire web app. You can set up a server, you can get it to listen to a port, make responses to various requests. But Express provides another layer of abstraction. If you want to be able to set up a web server quickly with minimum custom code, you would want to use Express.js. It is sort of the de facto Node.js web server. What Express.js does is it includes functions that make it easy to receive the HTTP requests, such as get, post, and delete from the web, and to route them to code that provides responses. So a way of thinking of that is if I make a request to a particular route, such as like /greet, I can route that to a section of code that has specific functionality related to that endpoint. So if I were to give a quick sample of what it might look like, if we had we'll start by importing the Express package. And then all you need to do to set up a server, which they call an app, is to invoke that Express library. That's it. And then at the end, all you need to do is tell this server to listen to a port, which quite often for development, we'll use 3000. And with that, we actually have all that we need. And then the one other thing that we can do is to listen to a particular route. So I can listen to the GET request, And the route that I'm interested in is simply /. And when that happens, I am going to respond with some code. So this is my, anonymous function that says I'm going to run this code when this route gets requested with a get. This function gets supplied with what is called the request and response objects. And then from there, all I need to do to be able to send some code back would be to use the response object and send some data such as hello world. And that is an Express app. We now have a server that works. It's pretty cool. Now, clearly we would do a whole lot more than this. And fortunately, there's some scaffolding projects out there that allow you to get set up with a lot of this to begin with. But I wanted to first highlight, before we get into the finer points of it, what Express is doing. More commonly, we're going to be rendering template HTML files and sending that back down as well. A common templating engine that Node developers use is called Pug, which was formerly known as Jade. And that is a way to write HTML and inject JavaScript values. So let's go ahead and pause there and see if there are any questions. Oh, nice. So there was a great question of why not do const this. I'll show the alternative. So the alternative being proposed would be just like that. This line of code here and these two lines of code here are equivalent. There is not any particular reason why you wouldn't want to do this. And if it seems like I am only going to use this package to immediately invoke it, then probably personally I would do this. For the purpose of being able to read and to help people who are less familiar with JavaScript, this is slightly easier to read because understanding what this does is a little bit trickier of knowing what it means to invoke one function and then to invoke it again, and to understand that with JavaScript and that JavaScript can return functions from other function calls, which seems so intuitive to people who grow up with JavaScript. But for people who don't, that is a mind-bending experience. Hence why we just did it here for this demo purpose. Great question, though. Yeah, learning that you can't just return functions from all JavaScript, from all coding languages was a really big surprise to me. Okay, so I'm going to actually delete this file now because we're going to use what we call an Express generator that will set up a whole bunch of boilerplate for our web app. And I don't want to have this conflicting with anything. So I'm going to go to the terminal and I'm going to type in a command, npx. npx is you can think of it as a way to run npm packages without installing them. So this is really nice for global tools, such as a generator tool, where you want to be able to run it, but you don't necessarily want to install it locally because it's going to keep getting updated. You're not going to remember to update the generator. And if you install it locally, then you just get your copy and then it's static. When you do npx, it basically says, just get me the latest copy of this, package and then run it for me. So it has become a very popular tool for being able to run global tools in NPM. And for those of you who haven't heard of NPM before, Let's just showcase that website. So NPM is your package manager for JavaScript libraries. So anything that you want to be able to do with JavaScript is going to be living inside of NPM, such as React, Angular, Axios, Lodash, Lambda, Express. All of these are available inside of NPM. Great. So the package that we're going to use is called Express Generator. So it's providing a warning saying the default view engine will not be Jade in future releases. Let's go ahead and specify that we want to use pug. So I'm going to say -- view equals pug. And it's also warning us that there's a README here, which is okay. So I'm just going to say, go ahead, don't worry about it. And then the first thing that I'm going to do is install the dependencies. You could use npm install, or you could use yarn. It doesn't really matter which one you do. Personally, I like to use yarn. If you don't know what yarn is, it is basically a competitor to npm. And in my it's like basically a package manager that does what npm does, except it doesn't host any of the code. So you use npm to store all of your code, but then you use yarn to like figure out how to bring all of the packages together in a way that is reproducible. And I have found that the functionality is still a little bit better with yarn than with npm, although npm has certainly picked up their slack, which is nice. So I will show using yarn, but npm is basically the same. So to be able to install using yarn, you just type in yarn, and it will go ahead and install the packages. Ta-da, all done. Let's take a look at what got generated. Whoops. There are a whole bunch of files that got created. It looks like a public folder that has some public assets. There's the routes that we were talking about with Express, and a few views. So we've got a whole bunch of changes. Boy, look at that. And I'm noticing that one of the things that's getting staged is all of my node modules, which is a bummer. Generally, the consensus is do not include node modules in your Git repository. So to be able to ignore this, I'm going to, let's see if there's a, whoops, not that. Is there a git ignore? Yep. So I'm going to highlight node modules, and then I'm going to type in git ignore and choose to add to git ignore. And let's see what that does. Nothing. Rats, come on. Okay, well, that didn't quite do what I wanted it to do. So I'm going to do this manually. I'm going to create a new file called .git ignore. And then inside of it, I'm going to ignore the node modules folder. And now we can see that I don't have 4,000 changes, I just have 11 changes. And these were all of the things that got added here. These all look good, so I'm just going to add a commit message here and say initial scaffolding of Express app. And then I can do command return and stage all of my changes and commit them immediately. And now we can see that I have one more change on my main branch than inside of my origin. Great. Oops. So let's take a look at our routes file. Here we have that code that we saw before. This is slightly different because we're using this router thing. We're not going to worry about that too much, but it like more or less looks the same, right? We have a GET request on /, and we're going to send some data back. And what we're saying here is that we want to render this index inside of our views. So when we render this, it's going to go to views, find index, and render this code. This code is kind of HTML-ish, but it uses a language that is slightly more terse. But basically, we're saying we have a h1 where we're going to inject a value of title. And then we're going to have a p tag where we say welcome to, and then we inject the value of title again. So let's run this. I'm going to say yarn start. And now we have our server running. And I can go to localhost 3000. Not there. Where does it run on? It appears that I have a different server running. I apologize. This is the project that I normally work on. There we go. And now we can see that we have our route. This is our slash route. And we have the title, which is being passed down as Express. And it is getting injected into the view here. So as you might expect, if I change this from here, from title to my awesome game and save it, and then I'm going to restart my server and refresh the page, we can see that we've got the code there. So that's a basic breakdown of the Express server system. Let's pause for questions. Yeah, one person provided in some additional context that Yarn was written by Facebook at a time when NPM had some bugs. That is quite indeed true. And Yarn had a great heads up on NPM for a number of years. There's also a question of what is this www.js file about? And it looks like this may be used to by the server to be able to execute and run the app. Yep. And we can see that if when I say yarn start, that command there is connecting to this package.json under the start script, and it is running the www script inside of bin. So this is just doing some scaffolding to set up the server in a way that makes sense. But we're not going to detail that much more. Great question. Okay. So let's now make some changes. The first thing we're going to do is add a launch time. And the launch date is going to be 12/29/2020 at 10 o'clock. And then I'm going to use this launch time and calculate the current time, get the difference, and then pass that down to the view. So here's the current time. Then I can figure out the number of milliseconds. Which is just the difference between these two values. And then I can pass in other values inside of my render. Like I can say countdown, number of milliseconds. And I want to not have a typo there. And let's put this onto 2 lines so that you can read that easier. Great. All right, now I just need to render that information. So I'm going to go back to the index file and change this p tag to say countdown. And I'm going to use the countdown variable and say that it is that many milliseconds. Let's restart the server. Refresh the page. We can see that now I have this many milliseconds until the release date, that many milliseconds. Boy, time is just flying. Okay, so we have an app running locally. Now let's learn how to deploy it using Azure. So Azure is a platform for basically doing anything that you need to do in the cloud. It is the Microsoft platform for it. It is the competitor to AWS and to Google Cloud Platform. And fortunately for you all, Azure App Service integrates very, very nicely with VS Code, which is unsurprising because they come from the same company. But it's a great boon to all of us because it makes our jobs just that much easier. So Azure App Service is sort of, it's like Heroku, if you ever worked with that before. It's a super easy way to take a web server, throw it up into a service and be like, I don't want to worry about how you get it going, but I want to be able to get a website and be able to hit it from anywhere on the internet. So it is a platform as a service. It provides an implementation of a web server and can host websites, REST APIs, backend services, you name it, it can probably do it. It supports a wide range of languages, ASP.NET, Node, Ruby on Rails, Java, PHP, Python, and it integrates really nicely with GitHub, Azure DevOps, all of your Git operations. So inside of an app service, what it does is it allows you to not use physical hardware or worry about installing operating systems. All you need to do is choose the resources inside of an app service plan. The plan includes details like what region it's running in, what size of the instances you're working with, and the pricing tier. And there's a lot of different pricing tiers. There's like shared and dedicated and isolated, and each one comes with more features and more cost. For us, we're going to be working with the free pricing tier because, I sure like free things. But you can always increase those tiers for a higher performance. So when we're working with the Azure App Service, we can include an extension called Azure App Service inside of VS Code to make it easier to visualize and deploy our web application. So let's actually go through that together. The first thing we're going to do, and I want to stage my changes. So I'm going to say add a countdown. Great. New commit created, and I'll go ahead and synchronize my changes. Ta-da! So let's go ahead and install the extension. So if I type in install, and there it is, it's install extensions. I can search for Azure App Service. You can choose that. I already have it installed, but if you didn't, you just click the install button and then you're done. Once you've done this, you have this handy dandy icon over here, which gives you access to the plans that you have. So I have a, pay-as-you-go plan, and I have a couple of projects that are already running inside of it. When you first do this, you're going to see something slightly different where it's going to prompt you to sign into Azure. If you don't have an Azure DevOps account, you would need to set that up. And then once you're done there, it will allow you to log in and see your resources that you have. So let's set up a new Azure App Service web app. So you can click the plus icon, and then I need to provide a globally unique name for the web app because this will be where the URL is. So I'm going to call this Reactor Demo Countdown countdown. And then I need to provide a runtime. In this case, I'm going to use Node 14. And now it's going to do a bunch of magic to create the resources necessary. And while we wait, let's check back in on any questions people have. One question was, what is a pug file? It is the templating language for writing HTML inside of Node and be able to inject JavaScript values into it. It is written in Node, which is why people like to use it. Can you add a background image in Node.js script? Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's like, if you use Webpack, there's an incredible amount of things that you can include inside of JavaScript. Unfortunately, we won't be covering that today because we are almost out of time. And then Mark asked, do you recommend using linters or code helpers in VS Code, particularly when starting out? Do they help or hinder learning? That's a great question, Mark. It can go two ways. I think that on the one hand, it can help identify where you made the mistake. But on the other hand, it can be very precise about saying, like, this is the issue, like you missed a space. And that isn't, it isn't actually an issue with your code, it's just a stylistic thing. And so it can sometimes create these negative feedback loops where your code's fine, but it's telling you that it's wrong, and it sort of sends you off on these paths of confusion of like getting confused about it. So I would say you try both, honestly. I learned with I'm a person who really likes to be precise with like style. So I really notice the things like how does the spacing look, and all of like where are things padded and where are they not padded. And I learn a lot by paying attention to those things, but some people don't, and they get really distracted by it. So I'd say, figure out what your learning style is, because there's not a right way. The right way is whatever facilitates you learning faster. At some point, though, you will need to learn how to work with a linter, because everyone works with a linter. But when you're just getting started out, I'd say try it out without it first. And if you're running into, yeah, I think I might suggest trying it out without one first. Olivia asked, can I show the index.js file one more time? Yes. So there's that index.js file. So we can see that we have the web app deployed, or we have the web app created. And now what we want to do is open it up. And I'm going to say deploy to web app by right-clicking on it. And this basically says, hey, take all my code, just stick it up there. We choose which folder to deploy, which is our current one. And then it asks us if we want to update the workspace configuration to run build commands on the target server. Workspace, this is new. Sure. And then it also asks if we want to always deploy from this. Do we want to deploy it will overwrite the previous deployment? Yep, that's fine. And it also asks us if we always want to use this folder. Yeah, I do. So we can now see that it is in the process of deploying. I can open up the output window and we can see it is, zipping up my files. And so what this deployment is doing is taking all of my files, sticking it into a zip, uploading it to a place where Azure can pay attention to it, where it will unzip those files, put it into a place where it can run the server, and then it just runs the server. And as long as you follow certain patterns of like how to execute and like set up your servers so that it like follows certain patterns, then all of this will work automatically. And I will scooch this down just in case Olivia wanted a little bit more time to look at that index file. Ooh, low battery, living dangerously. I think I'll be fine. So all it's doing right now is the install. I wish I could move this out of the way. It says that I have issues with my network connection. That's unsettling. It's always the case that whenever you make a demo, that's the time that it doesn't work. I did this last night just to like run through it again, and it worked perfectly fine. But of course, once I'm live, then it is running into problems. Well, that's pretty strange. I'm not sure what's going on there. I'll need to do some debugging to investigate that further. But let's go ahead and wrap up. So this process that we demoed here is to be able to deploy our web application. And in subsequent changes that we make, if we like add more files or change text or whatever, as long as we just save those files, we go to our Azure tab, we right click, and we say deploy to web app, then it will work perfectly. As long as there isn't some weird trouble with the network. So I apologize, I don't get to show you like the final punchline of this whole demo. It's pretty strange that that's happening. Let's see if we can stop the deploy and just try it again. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to do some more digging there. So just to reiterate, there are a couple of websites that are worth checking out that have these labs available on it. They have been linked inside of the Q&A and also in the chat. And just to reiterate that these are, what Microsoft has done is really quite impressive with their learning through their Docs platform. So if you ever want to learn a great deal, there's a lot to check out. For working with Azure, there's a ton of courses on learning how to work with Azure. There's stuff on how to work with Node and deploy full stack apps and all sorts of things. So it's a really amazing platform. There's a ton of content, and it's definitely worth checking out. So let's hop back to the slides. There, I'm curious if Emma, were you able to get a survey link code?
Yes, I was. Apologies, I was meant to send that to you. So the event code is 7964.
7964. So if you would like, please go ahead and click on or open up this survey link, which I will go ahead and also include in the Q&A. Whoops, I had a typo there. Code is 7964. Sorry about that. We really do value your feedback. It is the way that we learn and grow. So please do take the time to fill out that survey because it is much appreciated and we learn a great deal from it. Thank you again so much for your time. It's been really a great pleasure to work with all of you. My name is Andrew Smith. And Emma, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think you got just about everything, Andrew. And thank you to everyone who's attended. There were a couple of questions in there about how people can view this session afterwards, or if it's available afterwards. So it has been recorded and it will go on our YouTube Reactor channel by the end of the week. And I'll just drop a link to that in the Meetup London Reactor group when it is.
All right, well, thanks everybody. Good luck with your learning journeys, and hope to see you again sometime.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks everyone as well for attending, and see you at the next session.